2 billion letters. That is how many the British Army Postal Service handled over the 4 years of the First World War. Every love note, every plea for clean socks, every scrawl written by candlelight in a trench at 3 in the morning. Each one was opened, read, and judged by an officer before it went anywhere. And the men who wrote those letters knew it. They knew their own lieutenant, the same man they shared rations with, was reading every private word before the envelope got sealed. Then, in March of 1915, the British Army introduced a small green-colored envelope and told soldiers that this one would not be read by their commanding officers. It sounded like a gift. What it actually created was something far stranger. To understand why a colored envelope mattered this much, you first need to understand the scale of the operation moving mail between the home front and the Western Front. Because the British military postal system during the First World War was one of the largest logistics efforts of its time, and it almost never gets mentioned in the history books. When war broke out in August of 1914, around 11,000 postal workers from the General Post Office enlisted almost immediately. The GPO before the war was already the biggest employer in Britain, with over 250,000 workers handling nearly 6 billion items of post every year. The military took its people and its infrastructure overnight. By December of 1914, a purpose-built sorting facility called the Home Depot had gone up in Regent's Park in London. It was a massive wooden building covering 5 acres of parkland, and by 1918 it employed over 2,500 staff, most of them women who had stepped in to replace the men now fighting overseas. Every morning, supervisors at the Home Depot received classified updates from Whitehall listing the latest positions of ships and battalions, so each letter could be routed to the right unit. A fleet of army lorries then carried the sorted mail to the ports at Folkestone and Southampton, where ships shuttled it across the English Channel to Army Postal Service depots at Le Havre, Boulogne, and Calais. From there, the mail traveled on supply trains right alongside ammunition and rations, heading toward the trenches. In 1917, over 19,000 mail bags crossed the Channel every single day. And in the weeks before Christmas, that number more than doubled to 500,000 bags. By the end of the war, the Home Depot had handled roughly 2 billion letters and 114 million parcels. The speed was something else. A letter posted in Aberdeen or Wolverhampton could reach a soldier in the trenches of France in under 48 hours. A Times correspondent confirmed that parcels arriving at the base depot in France on December 18th had left Belfast only 5 days earlier and Glasgow 4 days earlier. That kind of turnaround mattered enormously, and the military knew it. In 1915, a soldier fighting on the Western Front wrote a letter to a London newspaper saying he felt lonely because he never received any mail. The newspaper printed his name and regiment. Within weeks, 3,000 letters, 98 parcels, and 3 bags of smaller packages arrived at his position. That is how desperately the public wanted to connect with the men at the front, and how much the soldiers craved that connection in return. Military commanders understood that mail was as critical to a soldier's fighting ability as food or ammunition. Almost every veteran who left behind written records said the same thing. Nothing mattered more to morale than the regular arrival of letters from home. A letter reminded a man that he still had a civilian identity waiting for him, that someone still cared, that there was a reason to survive one more day. And letters also flowed the other way, because for a family in London or Dublin or Auckland, only a letter in the soldier's own handwriting could offer proof that he was still alive. But all of that speed and efficiency came with a condition that most soldiers found deeply humiliating. Every letter written by an enlisted man had to pass through the hands of a junior officer in his own unit before it could leave the front. This was regimental censorship, and in the British Army, it lasted for the entire war. The censor's job was straightforward enough on paper. He scanned for anything that could help the enemy if the letter were intercepted. Troop locations, unit strengths, upcoming operations, officer names, anything that might reveal where a battalion was stationed or where it planned to move. If the censor found something problematic, he had 2 choices. He could black it out with ink, or he could cut it out with scissors, leaving a rectangular hole in the page. Then he signed the letter at the bottom, stamped the envelope with a censor's mark, and only then was it sealed and sent. The problem with this system was obvious to everyone who lived under it. These censors were not distant bureaucrats sitting in a government office. They were the soldiers' own officers, men who led them in combat and slept in the same dugouts. A private writing to his wife about how much he missed her, about the fear he could not shake, about the lice crawling through his uniform, or the officer who treated his men with contempt, knew that his lieutenant was going to read every word of it before breakfast. The discomfort ran in both directions. Captain Frederick Caulfield, a career officer in the British Expeditionary Force, wrote to his wife shortly after arriving in France in October of 1914, complaining that it was awfully hard to write anything when every word was read and censored. Caulfield was an officer, so he had a way around it. He could arrange for a trusted fellow officer to sign his envelopes without actually reading the contents, and many officers did exactly that. Enlisted men had no such option. Their letters were read by the very officers they served under, and everyone involved found the arrangement uncomfortable. The historian Desmond Morton described the dynamic bluntly. "Part of a soldier's humiliation," he wrote, "was knowing that his officers read every word of his personal letters and sometimes joked about them with fellow officers at meals." A German soldier recalled it with even sharper disgust, saying that every one of them felt sick watching a sergeant read letters meant for their wives at home. In Germany, intimate family letters were sometimes passed around and turned into a laughingstock, even after centralized censorship was introduced. And in some armies, saying the wrong thing could get you far more than embarrassed. In Italy, under General Luigi Cadorna's command, soldiers could be court-martialed for letters containing what the authorities called exaggerated or false information. Some were executed on the spot. In Germany and Austria-Hungary, similar punishments were on the table. The United States ran the most thorough system of all, with every letter passing through 3 separate layers of review: company censor, regimental censor, base censor. Each one read the same letter, one after another, and each could cut or redact whatever he chose. By the time an American soldier's letter reached his family in Massachusetts or Montana, it might have been picked apart 3 separate times. The result was predictable. Soldiers learned to say nothing real. They wrote about the weather, mentioned the food, asked after the dog, and avoided anything that mattered. The phrase "somewhere in France" became a standard heading because men were forbidden from naming their actual location. Letters home became performances, carefully calibrated to pass the censor without triggering cuts. The men knew that honesty could mean punishment, so they wrote cheerful nonsense or they wrote nothing at all. The army recognized early that this system was unsustainable. It devoured officer time, and it was corroding the morale of the very troops the military depended on. So 2 partial solutions were introduced, each designed to ease the burden on censors while keeping sensitive information from leaking out. The first was the Field Service Postcard, introduced in November of 1914. These were pre-printed cards produced by the millions, offering soldiers a handful of standardized sentences. "I am quite well. I have been admitted into hospital and am going on well. I have received your letter." Letter follows at first opportunity. The soldier crossed out the lines that did not apply, signed the card, and sent it with no censorship required. If he added so much as a single handwritten word beyond his name and the date, the card was destroyed. The literary scholar Paul Fussell described the Field Service Postcard as an exercise in implicit optimism because the printed options never acknowledged fear, suffering, or death. You could say you were quite well or that you were in hospital and doing fine. There was no line for, "I am surrounded by the dead and I do not expect to survive the week." The soldiers resented these cards so much that a parody form letter eventually circulated among the troops. It mocked the censorship restrictions with questions like, "How are the poultry?" includes cows, potatoes, children getting on, and ended with a box reading, "Insert here, protestations of affection, not to exceed 10 words. A copy of this parody was found in the war diary of a medical officer serving with the 6th Division at the Somme. The humor was dark, but the frustration behind it was real. The card stripped soldiers of the ability to say anything genuine, and they hated it. Wilfred Owen, the war poet who served as an officer on the Western Front and would later be killed just 1 week before the armistice, found the Field Service Postcards so frustrating that he worked out a secret code with his mother before leaving for France. They agreed that if Owen was being sent to the front lines, he would send her a postcard with the sentence, "I am being sent down to the base," struck out with 2 lines instead of 1. A single strike meant nothing unusual. A double strike meant combat was coming. His mother watched for that signal in every card he sent, and Owen used it to warn her of danger the censors would never have allowed him to state openly. 1 extra pen stroke on a mass-produced card, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. That tiny detail tells you everything about how badly soldiers needed to say something true. The second solution was the green envelope, and this is where the system gets genuinely fascinating. Starting in March of 1915, the British Army began issuing a special envelope printed on green paper, officially designated Army Form W3078. It was known to everyone as the green envelope or the honor envelope. The idea was straightforward. On the back flap, the envelope carried a printed certificate stating that the contents inside referred to nothing but private and family matters. The soldier signed this certificate on his honor, and the envelope could then be sealed immediately. His regimental officer was not permitted to open it. Consider what that meant for a soldier who had spent months knowing that every word he wrote was being read by the man who gave him orders. For the first time, he could write to his wife without his lieutenant scanning the page. He could say he was frightened. He could say that the conditions were worse than anything the newspapers were printing. He could write something intimate without wondering whether it would be read aloud in the officers' mess that evening. There was a catch. The green envelope was not truly private. Its contents remained subject to random examination at the base by censors who were far from the front and who did not know the writer personally. In practice, this check happened rarely because the volume of mail made it impossible to open every green envelope that came through. But the threat never went away. It was printed right on the envelope, reminding the soldier that the army retained the right to look inside if it wanted to. And the stakes for misuse were steep. Any soldier who broke the honor system by including military information in a green envelope was committing a serious military offense. A court-martial could follow. And since the envelopes were issued sparingly, typically 1 per week for officers and selected privates of good character, losing the privilege meant losing the only private channel available. George Ormsby, a soldier who watched this happen in his own unit, wrote home about it with frustration. "So many of the boys," he said, "took advantage of them and wrote home about their petty squabbles, how this officer treats his men, and complaints all around that the privilege was partly withdrawn and might be taken away entirely." After that, every letter would go back through the officer's hands. The green envelope forced an agonizing calculation. You could use your 1 envelope that week to say something real to the person you loved most. Or you could waste it on a complaint that might get the whole system revoked for your unit. 1 careless letter from 1 frustrated soldier could shut down everyone's privacy. And so even inside this small space of freedom, men censored themselves, measuring their words, rationing their honesty, the same way they rationed water and ammunition. For many soldiers, the green envelope still was not enough. They wanted to say things the system was built to stop. Where they were stationed, how bad it truly was. What was happening that the press back home refused to report. So they built their own workarounds, and some of them were remarkably clever. Monty Cleave, who served with the Royal Garrison Artillery, came up with one of the most elegant methods. He wrote his letters on very thin paper, and whenever his unit moved to a new position, he pushed a pin through specific letters on the page, making tiny holes that were invisible to anyone reading the text normally. His family knew to hold the paper up to the light and read the pinpricked letters in sequence. The string of characters spelled out his location on the Western Front. His parents tracked his movements for the entire war through nothing but minuscule holes in thin paper, and no censor ever caught it. Cleave recalled later that friends and family had taken an enormous interest in his war letters, following his path across France and Belgium through a code that was hiding in plain sight. An Austrian officer named Ottokar Hansel used a completely different system. Hansel was a mathematics and geometry teacher from Vienna who was drafted into fortress artillery 3 days after Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia in August of 1914. In June of 1915, he wrote to his wife Mathilde with a set of instructions. From now on, he told her, he would not underline anything in his messages. If anything appeared underlined, it meant the opposite of what it said. And any passage in brackets should be understood as toned down compared to reality. So if Hansel wrote that conditions were perfectly safe and underlined it, Mathilde knew he was in serious danger. If he placed a description of moderate shelling inside brackets, she understood the bombardment was worse than he could openly say. The emotional weight of Hansel's system is hard to overstate. Mathilde had to read every letter from her husband twice. Once for the version that would satisfy any censor, and once for the real meaning hidden underneath. Every cheerful sentence became suspect. Every underlined word was a silent alarm. She spent 4 years reading her husband's mail the way a codebreaker would read an intercepted dispatch, except the intelligence she was decoding was about how much danger her own husband was in and whether he might come home alive. Owen had his own layered system beyond the double-strike postcards. In his full letters, he and his mother had agreed on the word mistletoe as a signal. When she saw that word, she knew to read the letters that followed it in a specific pattern, pulling individual characters from the words that came after to spell out his location. It was a hidden acrostic woven into ordinary prose, readable only by someone who held the key. The censors, reading the letter at face value, saw a perfectly normal sentence. His mother saw coordinates. Other soldiers across every army used simpler and more direct methods. One of the most common was handing a sealed, uncensored letter to a comrade heading home on leave. That friend would carry the letter in his pocket across the channel and post it from a civilian post office in London or Manchester, completely bypassing the military postal system. These smuggled letters were the only ones where soldiers could write with absolutely no restraint. No censor had touched them. No officer had read them. They were raw and unedited, and they were often brutally honest about what was happening at the front. The most striking of these smuggled letters belongs to a New Zealand private named Leonard Hart. Hart was a former railway clerk from Southland who enlisted in 1915 at the age of 21. He had already survived Gallipoli. By October of 1917, he was on the Western Front, and his unit was ordered to assault the Bellevue Spur near the village of Passchendaele in Belgium. October 12, 1917, became the single deadliest day in New Zealand's military history. The New Zealand division attacked a fortified ridge held by German troops. The barbed wire in front of the German positions had not been cut by the preliminary artillery bombardment, which meant the soldiers advanced into intact wire defenses in broad daylight, while German machine gunners fired down into them from the high ground. By nightfall, 846 New Zealand soldiers were dead or dying, and another 1,855 were wounded. Hart's company went in with 180 men, 32 walked out. 1 week after the battle, on October 19th, Hart sat down and wrote a long letter to his mother, his father, and his sister Connie. He opened it by referencing a postcard he had sent a fortnight earlier, mentioning that he was on the eve of a great event. "Well," he wrote, "that great event is over now, and by some strange act of fortune, I have once again come through without a scratch." He did not mail this letter through the army postal system. He handed it to a fellow soldier departing on leave for England, who carried it across the channel in his pocket and posted it from a civilian office. The letter bypassed every layer of military censorship. What Hart wrote next was the kind of account the censors existed to prevent. He described the terrain his unit had crossed, 5 miles of utter desolation leading to the front line, with not a blade of grass or a tree standing, and dead horses and mules lying everywhere because no one had attempted to bury them. He wrote about soldiers getting hung up in uncut barbed wire and shot down in front of their surviving comrades. He described the survivors lying in shell holes as daylight broke, unable to move, because any man who raised his head was killed instantly. He noted the German marksmanship with bitter respect, and then he said what no censor would ever have passed. He called the battle a terrible blunder. He said that someone was responsible for the barbed wire not being destroyed before the men were sent forward, and he told his parents to disregard what New Zealand's newspapers were reporting because they were calling Passchendaele a success. Hart, who had watched 80% of his company die for 300 yards of useless ground, knew it was a catastrophe and refused to let his family believe otherwise. Historian Jock Phillips later described Hart's letter as a remarkable piece of writing, especially given Hart's limited formal education. It survives today at the Alexander Turnbull Library in Wellington. It exists because one soldier refused to let the censors control what truth his family deserved to hear. That is what the green envelope story is really about. It was never only a question of mail regulations or military security. It was about the distance between what soldiers lived through and what they were permitted to say. The censorship system served a real purpose. Troop locations and operational plans were genuinely sensitive, and a captured letter could cost lives. Nobody argues with that. But the system reached far past military necessity. It controlled the emotional story of the war. It ensured that families received a polished, harmless version of reality, and it made soldiers partners in the deception by forcing them to write cheerful fiction or say nothing at all. The green envelope acknowledged that something was wrong without actually fixing it. It gave men a small, rationed window to be honest, then surrounded that window with rules and warnings. Use it only for personal matters. Sign your name on the honor certificate. And remember, we can still open it if we choose. It was privacy with conditions attached, honesty on a short leash. So the soldiers went further. They punched holes in paper with pins. They reversed the meaning of underlined words. They hid map coordinates inside the word mistletoe. They handed sealed letters to friends and said, "Post this when you reach London." Every one of these workarounds was a quiet refusal to accept that the only version of the war allowed to exist was the one stamped by a censor. What those letters teach us, more than a century later, is something the military leadership already sensed at the time. People will find a way to be honest with the people they love. Regulate it, punish it, cut it out with scissors, and they will invent a new method. Pin holes through paper, codes hidden in brackets, letters carried home in a coat pocket. The need to tell the truth to someone who matters is not a habit you can stamp out of existence, no matter how many officers you assign to read the mail. There is also something else buried in this story, something the censors never intended to create. Because of the system, the letters that did get through uncensored are now among the most valuable documents of the entire war. They are the unfiltered record. The official dispatches told the general's version. The newspaper articles told the government's version. But a smuggled letter from a railway clerk in the Otago Regiment, written 1 week after the worst day of his life, told the version that mattered most, the version that was true. Historians today depend on those smuggled and coded letters to understand what actually happened in the trenches, because the censored letters, the official ones, were designed to say as little as possible. The very system that was meant to control the story ended up making the uncensored accounts more precious than anyone could have predicted. 2 billion letters crossed between the trenches and the home front during the First World War. Most of them said very little, because their authors were not allowed to say more. But scattered among them, hidden in green envelopes and smuggled pockets and tiny points of light shining through thin wartime paper, were the real stories. The ones the censors never got to touch. If this video taught you something new, subscribe and drop a like. Tell us in the comments which code or evasion method surprised you the most.